Moscow, the Lubyanka Building, 1937. There is a room in the basement of the Lubyanka that most people who entered never left. It was not a large room. It did not need to be. Its function was specific and required only enough space for one person to stand and one person to fire. The walls were designed to be hosed down. The floor sloped toward a drain. The acoustics of the building were managed so that what happened in this room was not audible in the floors above, where the administrative work of the Soviet security apparatus continued in the ordinary rhythms of bureaucratic life. This room, and rooms like it in NKVD facilities across the Soviet Union, was where the verdicts of the Stalin era were carried out. Not the public verdicts of the show trials, the theatrical proceedings that foreign journalists attended and reported on, the performances of confession and denunciation that provided the Soviet terror with its public face. The real verdicts, the ones delivered in the middle of the night, read to a prisoner who had often been told they were being transported to a labor camp, carried out with a single pistol shot to the base of the skull before the body had time to fall. The man most associated with those rooms, the man who made the machinery of execution function with the specific professional consistency that the Soviet terror required across nearly 3 decades, was Vasili Blokhin. He held the rank of Major General in the NKVD. His official title was the head of the Commandant's office of the NKVD. His actual function was the Soviet state's chief executioner, the man personally responsible for carrying out death sentences on a scale that has no parallel in the documented history of individual human beings killing other human beings. The estimates of the number of people killed personally by Vasili Blokhin range from 10,000 to 50,000. The documented minimum, based on the archival records that have been accessed since the Soviet collapse, establishes a number that is already beyond what the human imagination easily processes. The Katyn massacre alone, the operation in which Blokhin personally directed and participated in the killing of Polish prisoners of war in the spring of 1940, accounts for documented records of his direct involvement in the shooting of approximately 7,000 people over approximately 28 consecutive nights. This is not a story that is easy to tell or easy to hear. It is a story about what happens when a state decides that mass killing is an administrative function, when murder is bureaucratized to the point where it requires specialists, when the machinery of political repression produces not just a system, but the specific human beings who make the system work at its most fundamental level. It is a story about Vasili Blokhin, but it is also a story about the system that made him, used him, rewarded him, and then, when the system's requirements changed, discarded him. Vasili Blokhin was born on January 7, 1895, in the village of Gavrilovo, in the Suzdal district of Vladimir Province, into a peasant family whose circumstances were modest and unremarkable. The details of his early life are sparse in the available historical record, which is not unusual for someone of his background and generation. He received a basic education, worked as a peasant laborer, and was conscripted into the Imperial Russian Army during the First World War, serving in the military through the revolutionary period of 1917. His entry into the Cheka, the original Soviet security and secret police organization that was the predecessor of the NKVD, came in 1921, placing him among the early cadres of the Soviet security apparatus at a formative moment in its institutional development. The Cheka under Felix Dzerzhinsky was already in the business of mass execution, having conducted the Red Terror of 1918 and the subsequent operations against the Soviet state's real and perceived enemies with a thoroughness that established execution as a routine instrument of state policy. His progression through the ranks of the security apparatus over the following decade placed him in increasingly senior positions within the Moscow NKVD structure. By the early 1930s, he was established as the head of the commandant's office of the NKVD in Moscow, the specific institutional position that carried responsibility for the execution of death sentences in the capital. This position gave him oversight of the execution function and, increasingly, direct personal participation in it. The specific reasons why Blokhin became not just the administrator of executions, but their primary personal practitioner, are not fully documented in the available sources. What is documented is that by the time of the Great Terror in 1937 and 1938, he was functioning as the principal executioner for the Moscow NKVD, personally carrying out a significant proportion of the death sentences executed in the capital, and that this function was known to and approved by the senior NKVD leadership, and, through them, by Stalin himself. The organization of the execution function within the NKVD was a specific institutional structure that has been documented through the archival work of Russian and international historians following the partial opening of the Soviet archives after 1991. The documentation includes administrative records, the orders and receipts and transfer documents that the Soviet bureaucratic system generated, even for its most lethal operations, as well as the testimony of survivors and witnesses, and the accounts of former NKVD officials. The process by which a person moved from arrest to execution in the Stalin era was bureaucratically complex in its documentation, even as it was operationally simple in its conduct. A person would be arrested, typically at night, by NKVD officers operating on the basis of an arrest order generated by the security apparatus. They would be taken to an NKVD facility, held in conditions of isolation and uncertainty, subjected to interrogation that could involve physical coercion, and that was directed toward producing a confession of whatever crime the NKVD had decided the person was guilty of. The interrogation process was designed to produce documents that justified the predetermined conclusion. The investigator's goal was not to determine whether the arrested person had committed a crime, but to create a file that contained the necessary documentary evidence of guilt, principally a signed confession, that would support the sentence that had already been determined. The pressure applied to produce these confessions varied across cases and across periods, ranging from extended isolation and psychological manipulation to direct physical violence. Following interrogation, cases were processed through various judicial or quasi-judicial mechanisms depending on the period. During the peak years of the Great Terror, the most significant mechanism was the Troika, the three-person administrative body at the regional level that reviewed cases and issued sentences, including death sentences, in proceedings that lasted minutes per case and that processed hundreds of cases in a single session. The Troika system allowed the terror to operate at the industrial scale that the quotas handed down from Moscow required, processing cases far faster than any genuine judicial proceeding could manage. The death sentence, once issued, required execution. This is where Blokhin's specific function became central. The documentation of the execution process in Moscow, based on the accounts of former NKVD personnel and the administrative records that have been recovered, describes a process that was conducted at night, typically between midnight and dawn, in the basement facilities of the Lubyanka or the Lefortovo prison. The condemned would be brought from their cell to the execution room, informed at the last moment of their sentence, and shot. The standard method was a single pistol shot to the base of the skull, a technique that produced immediate death, and that was the standard execution method of the Soviet security apparatus throughout the Stalin period. The weapon used was typically a small caliber pistol, the Walther PPK, or similar weapon, chosen partly for the specific characteristics of the wound it produced, and partly for the practical reason that smaller caliber weapons produced less mess in enclosed spaces. The bodies were removed from the execution room, transported to disposal sites, typically special sections of cemeteries outside the city where mass graves had been prepared, and buried without markers or documentation that would allow subsequent identification by families. The documentation of where bodies were disposed of was maintained in NKVD records, but was not publicly accessible, meaning that families of the executed typically did not know where their relatives had been taken or what had happened to them. The scale of the execution operation during the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938 required not just a system, but the specific human beings to make it function. The NKVD employed multiple executioners across its facilities, but Blokhin was the most senior and the most prolific, and his role was not simply supervisory. He participated directly and extensively in the killing, working through the night sessions that the volume of sentences required. The physical and psychological demands of this work, the specific reality of personally killing large numbers of human beings in an enclosed space over extended periods, are documented in the accounts of former NKVD personnel and in the physical evidence of Blokhin's subsequent alcoholism. The coping mechanisms that people in this function employed, the specific psychological adaptations required to perform this work repeatedly without the breakdown that its nature might suggest as inevitable, are part of what makes Blokhin's documented history so disturbing. He was rewarded for this work. The decorations he received, the Order of the Red Banner, the Order of the Red Star, the Order of Lenin, awarded at various points in his career, were the formal acknowledgement of the Soviet state's appreciation for services that the award citations described in the vague bureaucratic language of distinguished service, without specifying the nature of the service. He received financial bonuses, additional food rations, housing benefits, the material rewards that the Soviet system provided to those whose function it valued. The Katyn massacre represents the most extensively documented episode of Blokhin's personal participation in mass killing, and it is the episode that allows the most specific and concrete understanding of how he functioned and at what scale. In the spring of 1940, following the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939 and the subsequent capture of large numbers of Polish military officers, police officials, and other members of the Polish educated and professional classes, Stalin and the Soviet Politburo made the decision to execute the Polish prisoners held in the NKVD's special camps. The decision, documented in the Politburo resolution of March 5, 1940, signed by Stalin and approved by the other Politburo members, ordered the shooting of approximately 22,000 Polish prisoners held in 3 camps: Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. The operation was assigned to the NKVD under Lavrenti Beria, and the specific management of the largest component of the operation, the shooting of the prisoners from the Ostashkov camp, was assigned to Blokhin. He personally traveled to the NKVD facility at Kalinin, the site designated for the Ostashkov prisoners' execution, to direct and personally participate in the killings. The documentary record of the Katyn operation, recovered from Soviet archives after 1990 and made fully public by the Russian government in subsequent years, provides the most detailed account of Blokhin's operational methods. He brought with him from Moscow a supply of German-made Walther pistols, which he apparently preferred for this type of work over standard Soviet weapons. He also brought a specific set of clothing that he wore for the killings: a leather cap, a long leather apron, and leather gloves that came up to his elbows, protective clothing designed for the specific physical nature of the work. The prisoners from Ostashkov were transported to the Katyn NKVD facility, individually processed through a brief administrative procedure in which their identities were confirmed against the lists, and then taken individually to a soundproofed room where Blokhin shot them in the back of the head. The bodies were loaded onto trucks and transported to the Medno burial site, where they were buried in mass graves that had been prepared in advance. Blokhin conducted this operation at a rate documented in the NKVD's own administrative records at approximately 250 to 300 shootings per night. The operation ran for approximately 28 consecutive nights. The total number of people killed by Blokhin personally at Katyn during this operation is documented at approximately 7,000. The logistical and physical reality of killing 250 to 300 people per night, night after night for nearly a month, is something that the human mind processes with difficulty. Each of those people was brought individually into the room. Each required a separate act of killing. The administrative processing, the physical transport of bodies, the loading and unloading, the maintenance of the facility and the weapon, all of this was organized around the central act of the shooting itself, which Blokhin performed personally night after night, at a pace that required both physical endurance and whatever psychological mechanism allowed him to continue. The drinking is documented. Blokhin and the other NKVD personnel involved in the operation at Katyn consumed significant quantities of alcohol during the period of the killings, and the documentary and testimonial evidence indicates that the vodka ration provided to the execution teams was understood by NKVD command as a necessary component of sustaining the operation's personnel through what was being required of them. The alcohol was not incidental. It was part of the operational support structure. The Katyn operation was the largest documented single episode of Blokhin's direct personal participation in mass killing, but it was not his only such operation. His career as chief executioner of the Moscow NKVD spanned nearly 3 decades, from the early 1930s through the early 1950s, and included participation in the executions of the Great Terror's most significant victims, including the former senior party leaders and military officers who were processed through the show trials and subsequent proceedings. The execution of Genrikh Yagoda, the former head of the NKVD, who had himself overseen the early phase of the terror before being replaced by Yezhov and subsequently arrested and shot, was carried out in March 1938. The execution of Nikolai Yezhov himself, who had overseen the peak years of the Great Terror before being replaced by Beria and arrested in 1939, was carried out in February 1940. The execution of Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and the other senior military commanders in June 1937. These executions of people at the highest levels of the Soviet system were the specific events that Blokhin was present for and participated in, and they place him at the operational center of the terror's most significant moments. The documentation of Blokhin's participation in specific high-profile executions is more fragmentary than the Katyn documentation, but sufficient to establish his consistent presence at the key moments of the Stalin terror's operation. His institutional position as head of the commandant's office meant that the most significant executions, those of people whose deaths required the personal oversight of the most senior execution official, were ones he was involved with. The total number of people personally killed by Blokhin across his career is a figure that has been estimated rather than precisely documented. The Russian Security Service's own assessment, based on the archival review conducted after 1991, has produced estimates in the range of 10,000 to 50,000 personal killings, with the figure of approximately 20,000 most commonly cited in the secondary literature as a reasonable estimate based on available documentation. This figure, whatever its precise accuracy, places Blokhin in a category that has no meaningful parallel in documented history. No other individual is known to have personally killed so many people under official state sanction across a single career. The institutional context that made this possible is as important as the individual. Blokhin did not operate independently or spontaneously. He was an employee of the Soviet state, functioning within an institutional structure that defined his role, issued orders that directed his actions, provided the material and logistical support his operations required, and rewarded his performance with promotions and decorations and financial benefits. He was, in the most precise sense, a state functionary performing a state function. The specific function he performed, the execution of death sentences, was a function that every state with capital punishment employs someone to perform. What distinguished the Soviet case was not the function itself, but its scale, the volume of death sentences generated by the terror and the industrial efficiency with which they were carried out, and the specific organizational culture that treated this function as a matter of professional pride and institutional efficiency, rather than as something requiring moral examination. Blokhin's identity within the NKVD was that of a consummate professional, the best at what he did, someone whose specific expertise was valued and rewarded. This professional identity, the self-understanding of a skilled practitioner in a demanding specialized function, is one of the most psychologically significant aspects of what he represents. He did not appear to experience the moral crisis that the nature of his work might seem to require. His professional self-concept, reinforced by the institutional culture he operated within, provided a framework within which what he did was normalized and valued rather than questioned. The end of Stalin's terror did not come cleanly or completely. The post-1938 period saw a reduction in the scale of the killing compared to the peak years of the Great Terror, but executions continued throughout the war years and into the post-war period. Blokhin continued in his position through these years, available for the execution function when it was required, his institutional position maintained even as the specific volume of his work varied with the political temperature. Stalin's death in March 1953 began the process of political change that would eventually produce Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin's crimes in the secret speech of 1956, the de-Stalinization process that reassessed the terror and rehabilitated many of its victims. For the people who had made the terror function, this period of reassessment was a time of danger and uncertainty. Blokhin was removed from his position in 1954, stripped of his rank in 1955, and deprived of his pension in the period following Khrushchev's denunciations. The specific grounds for his dismissal from the NKVD and the subsequent stripping of his rank involved the reassessment of the terror's operations and the institutional distancing of the post-Stalin security apparatus from the methods and personnel most associated with the worst of the Stalinist period. His fate after these institutional proceedings was not the execution or imprisonment that many of the terror's other significant figures received. He was not tried. He was not imprisoned. He was dismissed, stripped of his rank and pension, and left to exist in the changed political environment of post-Stalin Soviet society. The accounts of his final years, documented in the testimony of neighbors and in subsequent journalistic and historical investigation, describe a man who descended into severe alcoholism after his removal from his position, living in circumstances that deteriorated progressively across the years following his dismissal. The drinking that had apparently been part of his coping mechanism throughout his career intensified after the institutional structure that had provided the framework for his life was removed. He died on February 3, 1955, less than 2 years after Stalin's own death, in circumstances that the available documentation describes as connected to the alcoholism that had consumed his final period. He was 59 years old. The neighborhood around his Moscow apartment, in the accounts collected by journalists and historians who investigated his story in the post-Soviet period, suggests a man whose neighbors had some awareness that the person living among them had been associated with the security apparatus, but whose specific function was not publicly known. The specific knowledge of what he had done, the full scale of his personal participation in the terror's killing operations, was not public information in the Soviet period. The opening of Soviet archives after 1991 and the work of Russian human rights organizations, particularly Memorial, the organization dedicated to documenting the victims of Soviet political repression that was eventually itself shut down by the Putin government in 2021, brought the documentation of Blokhin's career into the public record in ways that were not possible during the Soviet period. The archival research that established the documentary basis for understanding his role and the scale of his operations was the work of historians and researchers who understood that the full history of the Soviet terror required accounting not just for the system and its leaders, but for the specific individuals who made its killing operations function. The Guinness World Records recognized Blokhin in 2010 as the most prolific state executioner in recorded history, a designation based on the archival documentation of his career. This recognition, clinical in its framing and disturbing in its subject, is the closest thing to a formal accounting that his specific historical role has received. The question of how to understand a person like Vasili Blokhin is one that the historical record presents without answering completely. The framework of the individual monster, the person of uniquely aberrant psychology whose capacity for violence sets them outside the range of normal human experience, is available but insufficient. Blokhin was a product of his system, shaped by the specific institutional culture of the Soviet security apparatus, operating within a framework that normalized and rewarded what he did, sustained by the collective organizational apparatus that provided the victims, the facilities, the weapons, the body disposal arrangements, and the professional identity that made the work continuous and sustainable. But the system's responsibility does not eliminate the individuals. Blokhin made choices within the system he inhabited. He chose to perform his function with the thoroughness and the professional dedication that distinguished his career. He chose the leather apron and the leather gloves and the German pistols that he brought to Katyn. He chose to be the best at what he did, to build and maintain the professional identity of the Soviet state's premier executioner across nearly 3 decades. The victims of Vasili Blokhin were human beings. They had names and families and histories and futures that his work eliminated. The Polish officers killed at Katyn, the Soviet military commanders shot in the basement of the Lubyanka, the party members and intellectuals and ordinary people caught in the terror's nets and processed through the administrative machinery to the moment when they stood in front of him in that basement room. Each of them was a specific individual person whose life ended in a specific moment by a specific act. The scale of the number makes this difficult to hold in mind. 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. These are numbers that the human imagination processes as quantities rather than as multiples of individual human experience. The memorial work of organizations like Memorial, which maintained databases of victims' names and photographs and biographical information, was the attempt to resist this abstraction, to insist on the individuality of each person consumed by the system. That organization has been shut down by the Russian government. The graves at Medno and the other burial sites of the Katyn operation have been marked and acknowledged, at least partially, in the long and difficult process of Russian-Polish historical reconciliation that has proceeded unevenly across the post-Soviet decades. The Russian government acknowledged Soviet responsibility for the Katyn massacre in 1990. The documentary evidence of the Politburo decision was released. The specific role of individuals, including Blokhin, in the operation's execution, was documented in the released archives. The broader accounting for the victims of the Soviet terror, the full documentation of who killed whom and by whose authority and under what institutional structure, remains incomplete. The archives are not fully open. The documentation that exists has not been fully processed. The political environment in Russia has moved in directions that make the continuation of this accounting more rather than less difficult. Vasili Blokhin died in 1955 in an apartment in Moscow, his rank and pension stripped, his institutional identity dissolved, his specific function no longer required in the changed political environment that followed Stalin's death. The alcoholism that had apparently been his coping mechanism throughout his career consumed him in his final months. He was buried without public acknowledgement of his role or his record. The people he killed were buried without markers in mass graves. The asymmetry of these facts, the man who did the killing dying in obscurity and the people he killed lying in unmarked ground, is itself a kind of historical statement about what the Soviet terror was and what it did to the basic human categories of acknowledgement and accountability. The system that made Vasili Blokhin necessary, that created the institutional role he filled, that generated the volume of death sentences that required a chief executioner of his specific capabilities, is the system whose history Russia continues to reckon with incompletely and whose victims continue to wait for the full accounting that their specific, individual, irreplaceable lives deserve. The basement room in the Lubyanka, with its sloped floor and its drain, was a product of administrative planning. The man who worked in it was a product of institutional culture and individual choice. The people who died in it were not products of anything except the specific human reality of having existed in the wrong place at the wrong time, in a state that had decided their existence was a problem requiring a permanent solution. Their names are in the archives, the ones that have been opened. Their graves are in the ground, the ones that have been found. And the man who put them there died drunk and alone in a Moscow apartment in 1955, stripped of the rank and the pension that had been his reward for services that the state, when the political weather changed, preferred not to fully acknowledge. That is the end of Vasili Blokhin's story. It is not the end of the accounting that his story demands.